All right, welcome to another episode of the Accidental Landlord Podcast. Today we have Dan from Landlord Horror Stories Podcast, or the Landlord Horror Stories Podcast. I don't know exactly the exact title. Maybe you can share that with us. But Dan, welcome to the show.
Peter, thank you for inviting me. And I don't know if I'll have the or not the in the podcast title. Right now it's not, but I'm not too picky.
Yeah, so why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us, how did we arrive at this Landlord Horror Stories Podcast? Maybe a little bit about yourself.
Sure, absolutely. So I host the Landlord Horror Stories Podcast. It is a show where I have real landlords on, and we just kind of explore just the wild side of the business. I like to say that being a landlord, you're not in the spreadsheet Excel business. You're in the people, the hospitality service, right? And that just means that a lot of just craziness happens. It just happens with this profession. But I've been doing real estate for 5 years now. I like to say the first 3 years were me really just trying to understand how I could get into the business as far as saving money, earning enough money, knowing all that I could about the investment class. And so far, we've got 5 doors. We are about to move into our house hack. And I'm all about real estate and love talking about real estate.
Awesome. And what part of the country are you in?
Midwest. So I live in Chicago, and my properties, for the most part, are in Milwaukee.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Well, let's get into it. I think it's really important to highlight when things go wrong, right? Because we don't want to paint this picture where everything's great and nothing bad happens and people just get rich off of real estate, which, does happen. But there is, I guess you could call it an ugly side. I mean, it's not always great, and things don't always go well. And if you've been doing this for any length of time, you are going to run into problems, and that's okay. That's a part of the business that I think everybody accepts. But it's wise to learn from other people's mistakes, and because there's nothing, I shouldn't say nothing because you never know, something out of left field could happen, but most of the things that happen bad with rental properties have happened to people before. And there's information, content, shows like yours that are out there that help landlords learn. So I think what would be fun today is to go over some of the horror stories that you've highlighted or that you're aware of and see what lessons we can pull out for our listeners. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. And I think that to kind of add on to that, what I've just seen, I love Twitter. I'm on Twitter all the time. And the real estate side of Twitter, it's like either real estate is perfectly passive, it's wonderful, all sunshine, rainbows, and a slice of bread, or it's awful, landlords are terrible. I know a guy who had a couple rental properties and it ruined him, right? So I think that there is, there's a middle ground there, and that's what I try and do, and what I try and talk about is like bad things can happen, and you should expect bad things to happen, but there are always a solution. You're not the first person to have gone through that problem. And also in putting together the show and reaching out to people who have a lot of rental properties and asking them like, hey, do you have any good horror stories? Which is kind of a weird way of putting it, good horror stories. And a lot of people said no, that they don't, right? Like everything has been good for their business. They haven't had a house burned down or flood. So I always kind of take that as a nice little nugget of positivity.
Yeah. So just for your context, we own a property management company, and we manage roughly 350 homes. And yeah, bad things happen. We had a fire in a house, which I'm happy to talk about it at some point. But and there were definitely lessons learned. A lot of things we did good, in protecting our clients' interests. But yeah, it's just a matter of time. I mean, great for whoever's saying they've never had anything bad happen, but it's going to happen eventually. But anyhow, I know you prepared some stories, and we were chatting about them before we started. But let's dive into them. So why don't you share the first one with us?
Sure. So I put together 3 stories that I had on the show, and kind of going from least crazy to most crazy. And the first one is the importance of a certificate of occupation, comes from the episode titled A Year Without Tenants. And what ended up happening was I interviewed Justin Brownwoods, who is the host of the Price of Avocado Toast podcast. It's a show about millennials and money and budgeting. It's a really fun show, and I'm a good friend of Justin's. And he had a situation where he had saved up a good chunk of money, and living in California, such as yourself, and he's like, I need to buy a rental property. Everybody's talking about real estate. I need to buy a rental property, right? It's the smart thing to do with this, little bit of money that I've put together. And he also wanted to be the poster child of a good, ethical landlord. That was really important for him. So his thinking was, let's buy a rental property in a tenant-friendly market. Let's support that market. And so they went to Michigan. They found this town. I think it was Warren, Michigan, which is like a satellite little town outside of Detroit. And he's like, it's super tenant-friendly, awesome. And he found this property like right around $100,000, and he bought it. But what he didn't realize is that the property did not have a certificate of occupation. And what that means is that legally people cannot live in this property. So he was not going to be able to get tenants. He had to get this figured out. And then COVID hit. And everybody who was doing work or was in the real estate space around COVID knows that it was impossible to get contractors. It was impossible to get building materials, and also just local governments. Everything just kind of seized to a stop. So he ended up doing this whole dance with the local government, where inspectors would come out and they'd be like, okay, this, and this needs to get replaced or fixed. And he'd be like, great. A couple months would go by. He'd call him back up and say, I did all of it. Can you come out and give me that certificate so I can finally get tenants in? Another inspector would come out and be like, yeah, these are fixed, but this, and this also need to be replaced. So and he ended up realizing is he bought this property from a flipper who did the bare minimum, nothing was to code, and over the course of 13 months, Justin had to basically untie this knot that was tied for him. And at the end of it, he's like, I've lost so much money, I'm just going to end up selling it. So he ended up selling the property. I think he said he lost about $25,000 on it. Mm-hmm. But what I found really inspiring about the story is that at the end of these conversations, I always like to ask, has real estate been a net positive or a net negative for you financially? And he said, well, financially it's been a net negative, but I learned so much with this first deal that it's not stopping me from buying the next property. And so what he ended up saying is, I still want to be a good ethical poster child for a good ethical landlord, but I can't do it in a situation where I'm not actually able to be a landlord, right? Like I need to go be in a place that has, is easier for me to work in business-wise, but be a good landlord there, kind of on my terms, not being dictated. This is, specifically legally what a good landlord is.
Yeah, there's some things to unpack here. So it sounds like he bought it from like a wholesaler or somebody, like not was he represented by a realtor when he made the purchase?
He was represented by a realtor, and when he talks about it, it was on the MLS, and it was a flipper who did work on this property.
Gotcha. So that's interesting because, I mean, if you have professional representation, like that's some of the stuff that they're supposed to disclose or find out for you. So I'd say lessons on that one was do more homework up front. Like even in our area, we have properties that come up and it's like explicit, like these are non-conforming rooms. This is a problem, which is, jargon for if you buy this property, you're going to have to fix all these issues. Obviously he probably jumped into it, unaware of some of that stuff. Otherwise he for sure probably wouldn't have bought that house. But what I want to talk about is, what does a tenant-friendly, market really mean? And I think that I'm interested. I don't know if you can answer for him, but I wonder his opinion on that change, because in my mind, we're in California. It's it's one of the most tenant-friendly states.
Yeah, you're in the Mecca. You're in the Mecca.
Yeah, it doesn't mean though that tenants are treated well, because the reality is, most landlords don't treat tenants well. There's this whole landlord versus tenant adversarial relationship in our market, in every market, I would argue. And I try to actively fight against that because I think it's counterproductive for both parties. But just because you're in a pro-tenant state or a pro-landlord state, in my opinion, doesn't translate to the tenants are taken better care of or the landlords are taken better care of. It just means that some of the regulations that politicians pass lean more towards one side or the other, there's plenty of people who would argue that those things are actually counterproductive to the tenant or to the landlord. But do you know if his opinion of that changed, or was he kind of going in there with, rose-colored glasses, and he doesn't feel that way anymore? Or?
The way that he talked about it, it kind of sounded like, he also lives in California, so he's very well aware of, being, California being very tenant friendly. I think that his approach was, let's go to another state, a little bit more affordable to work in, and kind of support the tenants in that market, because otherwise landlords might not want to go into that market, right? Because it is tenant friendly.
Yeah.
There does seem like there were a lot of his glasses were very rosy, let's just say. And at the end of it, I just thought it was very poetic when he said, I want to be a good landlord. I want to be an ethical landlord, but I need to do it on my own terms and by my own definition.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is a good intention, and I applaud that, and I also believe that. But like, we're in California, which is pro-tenant, and we're good landlords. I don't think that the political climate necessarily dictates the type of landlord you're going to be. I think what dictates the type of landlord you're going to be is some conscious effort to intentionally be one way or the other, right? But very interesting. Yeah, that sounds like that was a hard lesson to learn. Which I would say the takeaway from my perspective is do more due diligence up front, verify some of these things. I guarantee you in his next property, he's going to verify the certificate of, by the way, in our market, it's called certificate of occupancy. Obviously in different markets, they call it different things, but he's probably not going to make that mistake again. And hopefully our listeners will take this and, likewise not make it. I thought you were going to say he bought it from a wholesaler, which is people that what wholesaling is, I'm sure. People who aren't, it's not regulated by realtors, which has pluses and minuses. And if you're brand new, that would say that's probably a minus. But obviously mistakes happen when you're represented too, because if he used a realtor, he got screwed in that deal as well.
Yeah.
So.
To add just a little bit of color, the way that he described it is he was aware that it didn't have a certificate of occupation, but again, it was pre-COVID. And I think his realtor didn't do him any favors and just was like, oh yeah, it's just, you just have to have the city come out.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. So then I guess the due diligence would be probably should have talked to the city, but you can't predict COVID either. So maybe it's just all lined up against him. Probably a little bit of everything, but okay. Awesome. Yeah. Good lesson to learn for our listeners. And like I said, he probably won't make that mistake again would be my guess. What do you got? What's next on the list there?
All right, so number 2 is called Arson in the Mobile Home Park. True to its name, there was a fire that burnt down a mobile home in this investor's park. Investor's name is Logan Moffett out of Utah, and tons of properties. He owns tons of single family, tons of multifamily, but he didn't own anything on the mobile home park side. And a deal just kind of came across his desk, and he was like, this is way too good to be true. Like, these numbers are awesome. And so he's just like, you know what? Maybe I will. Maybe I'll go into this whole mobile home park thing. And he ended up, I think he negotiated really well. I think he also got like a house and some land on top of it to kind of sweeten the pot even further. So he bought this property. He's kind of learning the ropes of mobile home parks. And he said, I didn't really think about it, but how the mobile home park is 5 minutes away from this beautiful new prison. In his words, beautiful new prison. And then he did say, I don't know how beautiful it is on the inside, but from the outside it looks pretty cool. So what ended up happening was this mobile home was being rented by this woman, and her boyfriend was an ex-violent felon. And there was some sort of altercation between the two of them. And the boyfriend ended up pouring gasoline throughout the whole house, lit a match, lit up this mobile home. It just complete loss, absolutely destroyed, $30,000 in damage, and sadly 2 dogs ended up dying in the fire. And he got a call, and it's just like he had no idea, right? Like very, very different managing mobile homes compared to single family, and it was just a learning curve that he had to learn. And one of the lessons that he learned is that it's really difficult to insure mobile homes because they're just not all that durable. I mean, mobile homes are not appreciating assets; they are depreciating. I mean, the value is in the land, the value is in the infrastructure and the plots, right? I don't own any mobile homes, but just in my conversations, that's really where the value is. It's not owning the actual structures. And he also said that these mobile homes are not the most sturdy, the most flame retardant properties, right? Like they go up fast, and it's really scary because they are very flammable. And he's also talked about in a whole different story that they had a lot of wind, a big storm one day, and a couple of these structures, basically blew to the side, caved in. So they're just unique, and he's ended up purchasing a number of other mobile home parks, and he's got a huge portfolio. He loves the asset class. It's just different than single family, different than multifamily. And what he also likes about the asset class, kind of going on to positivity, is that the residents in these parks typically are also the handymen who are able to work on things when things come up that need to be replaced or fixed. And in this case, this mobile home had to be carted out, had to be trucked out, had to be sent to the dump. And so he was able to negotiate one of the other tenants who had his big truck to chunk it out and to remove all the debris. So, and that ended up saving him a good chunk of money. But again, a little bit different than single family, a little bit different than multifamily.
Yeah, so I have a couple clarifying questions, because in mobile home parks, sometimes you don't own the mobile home. Like you just own the infrastructure, and then the tenants own the homes and they pay rent. And the owner of the mobile home park is not necessarily responsible for the mobile home. But then in other cases, they own everything. What is I assume that's what was happening here?
So in this case, it was a lease to own agreement, I want to say, but I think that he did, in buying the mobile home, he did buy all the structures.
Gotcha. Which, from my perspective, is difficult because, like you said, they're basically disposable.
Yeah.
They depreciate in value, and literally they're worth nothing after 15 years, or I don't know what the numbers are. But okay, so when he bought this, did he inherit these tenants, or did he place these tenants?
He inherited these tenants.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I want to say when it came to the boyfriend was not on the lease, so the boyfriend was not vetted.
Gotcha. So what were the takeaways?
The takeaways is that, again, mobile homes are really difficult to insure when it comes from an insurance perspective, just because they are depreciating, not the most sturdy. They are very flammable. And this case, but also kind of another case, is that just sometimes there's not a lot of communication from the tenants to the actual ownership. He said that one time he had one of his handy guys going through his mobile home park, and there was a house that there's a bad storm a couple days ago, completely fell over, a complete total loss, and nobody told him. Like, nobody called him. The first he heard about it was a couple days later from maintenance. So my other takeaway is that it's a unique asset class that is very different compared to single family, very different than multifamily. And it really helps to have boots on the ground, depending on how large of a development you have.
Yeah, was he self-managing from a distance, or how was he managing it?
He was self-managing. He was not local. I don't know how far away he was, though, but I know that he wasn't going in and out these parks every day.
Yeah, so and I'm just giving my spin on this just from our experience. If we have so a couple things. One, the management of those lower income mobile home parks is typically more intensive, right? So like to do that from a distance or yourself, and you don't have experience in that asset class, is problematic, right? Like you probably want someone who understands mobile home parks managing your mobile home parks, right? For starters. The other thing is, clearly the leases weren't being enforced, right? So like if you have someone who moves into a property that's not on the lease, that's a management problem. Like the property management should catch that and address it as a lease violation, which in this case, if they, hindsight's always 20/20, but if they would have known that happened through like routine inspections, walking the parks, talking to people, those types of things, then they potentially could have prevented that, right? But I think it's dangerous to, one, get into a new asset class you don't know a ton about, although there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody can learn, right? But then not managing it effectively, and then maybe ended up in the situation he was in. So that's kind of from the details you shared, like those are things that would be concerning to me. They're not like passive. Like I would never buy a mobile home park and then not put management in place, or I mean, let alone probably wouldn't want to manage it myself if I lived in the town, just because of, you know, the asset class, the types of tenants that typically rent those properties can be difficult. Obviously, there's good people everywhere, and I'm not saying anybody that lives in a mobile home is not good. But you need to be, the landlord needs to be able to catch things like that when they happen, like a violent felon moves in, not on the lease. Like that's a lease violation 101 for a landlord, right?
Yeah,
So,
I would characterize that as a red flag.
yes, definitely, definitely. So good thing for our listeners is you got to enforce the lease. You got to inspect the properties. You need to know what's happening. And if you're going to manage on your own, which most landlords do, you got to do these things. It's not just, collect the rent, check in every once in a while and hope everything goes good, especially in some of these tougher asset classes. And if you don't have the chops or the desire to do that, then you need to put professional management in place, which is obviously a whole nother conversation in the investor world, because there's so many bad property management companies out there. That's not as easy as it sounds either. So, but good lesson nonetheless. I would say effective management wasn't happening, probably led to some of these issues. Is that fair? You think that's a fair characterization?
I would say so. And in Logan's credit, he, very successful investor, has a huge portfolio. But this was the first time he got into mobile homes. So
yeah,
I don't necessarily want to call it growing pains, but you could call it growing pains.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like we all started somewhere, right? And figure it out as we go. The idea is people coming behind don't have to learn those lessons the hard way, which is why this type of conversation is so valuable. And your show, I think, is huge, because if you could stop one landlord from making one mistake that's going to cost them, like the previous one year of no rent, then that's a victory, right? So yeah, definitely good lessons. What's the next one on your list?
So the last and final story is called "Grandma is a Gangbanger." There's an investor who I had on the show, and he has a duplex in Tennessee, and I can't quite remember which city it is. It might be Louisville, and it's a duplex. He bought a duplex. One side of it is rented. Awesome tenant. This guy, the way that the guest was talking about it, a little bit of a hermit, keeps to himself. Just great guy. But he had an opening right next door. And a young man came up to him and said, "Hey, I'd like to rent this side of the duplex." So they went through, checked everything. He just graduated high school, 18, 19 years old. Nothing came up on the background check. That's great. One issue is that his income really wasn't there to qualify, right, for the rent. And so, because no worries, I'll get my grandma. My sweet grandma, she works at this facility, at this factory. She actually makes equipment for the police, little known fact. And so he's like, okay, great. Yeah, have her co-sign. And then it's like, perfect, qualified, boom, move in. And then the grandma also moved in. So it's just like, hey, you know what? Grandma moves in. Like, who's going to misbehave when grandma's around? This kid, apparently. So what ended up happening is he kept on getting calls of just people like just parking outside, loitering around, coming in, and then quickly coming out. And so he's like, it sounds a little bit weird, right? But the kid's with his grandma, right? Like what's going on? Maybe they're baking tea or something. What ended up happening was a shootout between the police and this side of the duplex. The grandma got arrested. The kid did not get arrested, I don't believe. And the police called him up and said, "Hey, do you know who you're renting to?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, the kid with the grandma." Like, what's going on? And so, well, we just had a shootout with them. However many thousands of dollars of drugs, guns, money were we found at this property, and we actually found out she is the leader of the local Crip gang, right here in Tennessee. We've actually been looking for her. Like she's really important, right? Apparently what she was doing is she was running her gang through all of her grandchildren who were going out and committing all sorts of crimes. And since they were under 18, they didn't have nothing was on their adult record, right? So even if they did get in trouble with the police, which they were, you wouldn't really hear about it once they turned 18. And it was the case with this guy, right, who just graduated. And he's like, well, I vetted them, right? I did a background check. And they're like, yeah, he did a whole bunch of messed up stuff, but it's all filed under his juvenile record, whatever the term is. You wouldn't have been able to find it because he just turned 18. And they ended up having to go back and forth trying to get them evicted, and there was also COVID thrown out in this as well. And the judge basically said, I don't want to convict them. I don't want to evict them until we convict them, right? Because everybody's innocent until proven guilty. So the kid was still living in this house, and this poor next door neighbor who's just, the best tenant was just kind of dealing with all this. And so they ended up getting convicted, was able to evict them, turn the property, and the next people who moved in, he was like, they're great, haven't had any issues. But who would have thought? Who would have thought that a grandma would just be so ruthless?
Yeah. So what is? There's a lot here. What are your takeaways from this one? I have some thoughts for sure.
Well, I think up top I mentioned how we're not in the spreadsheet business. We're in the hospitality. We're in the service business. Mm-hmm. And things, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2, right? Especially with people. People change, life happens, or people are just, not the most forthcoming in this case. And you have to be kind of prepared for that. You have to be kind of prepared that, that little old grandma might not be as innocent as one would believe. And, you can do everything when it comes to screening, background check, credit check, all this type of stuff. But, people can surprise you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this one was preventable. And was this gentleman managing on his own, or was he using a professional to manage?
He was managing on his own.
Okay. Here in California, actually federally, there's fair housing laws, right? So they definitely apply there. In California, they pile on more fair housing laws. They have a state agency as well. You're not allowed to make decisions based on anything of a protected class. And in this case, not that he discriminated against anybody, that's not what I'm saying, but the point I'm trying to make is, in order to stay compliant with fair housing laws, really we shouldn't be making decisions on like gut feelings, stories, what you feel from the people that you're talking to. Like in this case that you're saying, 18-year-old kid doesn't have the income, ask grandma. The landlord's like, oh yeah, grandma, I'm sure she's going to be, baking apple pies, handing them out to the neighborhood kids. Obviously that's not the case, but I would argue from a fair housing perspective, the fact that she was grandma shouldn't even factor into it. Her age shouldn't even factor into it, right? Like you have to be able to, I know you said this isn't a spreadsheet business, but in some cases you do need to be making decisions based on data that literally lives on a paper, right? And not what your gut feeling is from so-and-so who you met who seemed like a nice little old lady or something along those lines, right? So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, in our business, we have a policy that we don't accept cosigners. And the reason is cosigners are extremely difficult to hold accountable. Like if someone moves into a property of ours and they don't qualify on their own and they have a cosigner, there's all kinds of rules related to collecting from the cosigner, especially if the cosigner's in another state, makes it even harder. So most professional companies don't accept cosigners, which would have eliminated this problem completely, because they would have been like, I'm sorry, we don't accept cosigners, you don't qualify, move on. So there's that. So I think in my book, this never would have happened if you had a policy about cosigners and then, you made your decision based on like objective data that you can see. Because maybe did the grandma actually have income that was documentable, or did he just go because it's grandma, she must be upstanding? Or
well, there was some irony in it. I don't know what the kid was doing, but the grandma was working at a factory that made equipment for police, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, very ironic. But the lesson here is, and I don't want to say, but if you've been a landlord over time, you're going to get jaded because you get lied to occasionally. And these are just, by the way, bad seats. And there's bad landlords just like there's bad tenants. So I'm absolutely not characterizing tenants as bad. But there are bad tenants, just like there's bad landlords, just like there's bad everything in every profession. And you come up against enough of them and get jaded, then you probably start making decisions that are different than when you first got your first duplex, right? So another good lesson to learn, and we see this in our business. Somebody wants to approve a tenant that doesn't qualify, and they do it anyway, and it turns into a mess. And then they come back to us and go, I thought I had it figured out. I didn't. All these bad things happened. Now I want you to fix it for me, type of a thing. And a lot of times people get away with making bad decisions, but eventually you're going to get caught, like making a bad choice on what tenant you're going to rent your property to, or one of those things. The other statistic that's out there is the most litigated part of a landlord-tenant relationship. The most lawsuits come from who you pick to live in your house. So it's really imperative that if a landlord is going to manage a property on their own, that they follow the fair housing laws and they don't make decisions based on a protected class, which nobody in their right mind would go, I'm going to discriminate against this race. Like, that generally doesn't happen. But there's so many protected classes that they don't even know when they're violating those fair housing laws, like family makeup, source of income. There's a bunch of them out there. Most people aren't racist running around, but there's a lot of people who are uninformed about some of these protected classes who essentially are discriminating against them, which is virtually the same thing in the legal eye. So very, very good, interesting information. I've seen, and the bummer is I've seen so many horror stories, like, because people sometimes come to us when they've messed things up based on this exact thing here, not doing a proper screening and then having it, come back to haunt them. So yeah, good story. What are your thoughts on that?
I just can see it. I can put myself in this guy's shoes. You're imprinting your own experience with your own grandma and the relationship that you had with your own grandma, if you're lucky enough to have them, right, with your own personal grandma. And then just to be kind of punched in the gut with what you end up hearing about is, it's like, if you can't trust grandma, who can you trust?
Yeah. What did that cost him when it was all said and done?
I don't quite remember. I don't think that we discussed the money in hand. It doesn't sound like the property was like destroyed. I mean, outside of the bullet holes.
Bullet holes.
It's kind of been funny in doing this show and speaking with people. I have become a little jaded when it's like, oh, I had this massive flood, and it's like, okay, well, how much damage did the flood cause? And they're like, oh, it cost $15,000. And it's just like, I'm kind of at a point where unless it's near six figures, I don't know if it's really necessarily the best fit, when it comes to flooding, just because everybody's got a flooding story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the reality is if you're a landlord and there's a catastrophe at your property and it's covered by your insurance, it's not that big of a deal. You're probably going to make a couple mortgage payments on your own, but you should have reserves. You're going to be made whole if the insurance accepts the claim, which is a whole different monster to talk about, right? Because sometimes insurance companies aren't working in your favor. But in our area, we had the largest wildfire in California history blew through our area, and we burned down, I don't remember, like maybe close to 1,000 homes, like burned them to the ground, like scraped them off the foundation, started over. And at the time it was tragic. And thankfully nobody died, no civilians died. We did lose a firefighter, which was tragic, but scraped those houses to the ground. 3 years later, all those owners of those properties are in a much better spot. They have a brand new house with way more equity than they had before, and almost like it never happened. The only thing that is tragic when something like that happens, if somebody gets hurt or dies, that's irreplaceable. But if it's just the house, just the property, it's arguably not that big of a deal. What I always tell people is the bigger risk to you is not that your house burns to the ground. It's that you unknowingly break a law. your tenant files a lawsuit against you and your insurance doesn't protect you because you should have known that you shouldn't have broken that law. That's the bigger threat, because that's when you're going to see multi-million-dollar judgments and financially ruin the landlord. That's the big risk that isn't talked about as much. Most people are worried about their property. Like, did the tenants put holes in the walls? Did they do all these bad things to the property? My counterpoint is, it doesn't matter what it does matter. I don't want to act like it doesn't, but that's not the biggest risk to the landlord. The biggest risk to the landlord is that they're going to get sued because they did something they didn't know was wrong. So,
yeah,
which I'm sure you're going to come across this in your podcast, because you're going to come up against these stories for sure.
Yeah, and that is also the silver lining in a lot of it, right? Like, you go through, this happens, and then you're left with a new house that, and then all of a sudden your equity goes up. It's just, you never want to see anybody get hurt. And at the same time, you also just don't want to see people's personal effects get ruined or, get lost, which is, just always said, you can't replace, a lot of those old pictures that are not on your phone.
Well, Dan, this has been great. If our guests or our listeners want to keep an eye on what you're doing or listen to the show, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. So Landlord Horror Stories comes out every Tuesday, Apple, Spotify, Google Play. You can also find us on Twitter, same name, Landlord Horror Stories.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we link it to the show notes. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate you sharing those stories. I know our listeners are going to definitely learn some lessons from them.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Peter.